Imagine dancing uncontrollably. Not for a few minutes at a party, not for an hour in a sweaty club, but for hours, then days, then weeks, until you collapse from exhaustion, or worse. Sound ridiculous? Welcome to Strasbourg, 1518, where dancing wasn't just contagious, it was deadly. Welcome to Probably Not True, the podcast where weird history comes to get fact-checked, debunked, and occasionally dragged through the mud of skepticism like a medieval peasant being hauled to a witch trial. I'm your host, professional buzzkill, amateur historian, and today we're diving into one of the strangest, most chaotic footnotes in European history. The Dancing Plague of 1518. Yep, you heard that right. The Dancing Plague. It's a story that sounds like the fever dream you get after binge watching too many historical dramas or Doctor Who episodes. In the sweltering summer of 1518, dozens, maybe even hundreds of people in Strasbourg allegedly danced themselves to death. No music and no apparent reason, no vibes, just days and days of relentless, uncontrollable boogieing until they collapsed from exhaustion, dehydration, or according to some accounts, outright cardiac arrest. Was it mass hysteria brought on by famine, disease, and religious anxiety? Poisoned bread, the medieval equivalent of a bad acid trip? Demonic possession, because naturally, the devil was always lurking around medieval street corners ready to ruin your day? Or was it just history's worst and final silent disco? A disco where instead of bad DJ remixes, the playlist was your own existential misery. The Dancing Plague wasn't just a weird day out, it left chroniclers baffled, city officials panicked, and doctors prescribing some truly questionable remedies. Oh, you're dancing uncontrollably, well, have you tried more dancing? Today we're digging deep into what really happened in Strasbourg, separating fact from folklore, and the hysteria from history. Let's find out, was the Dancing Plague a real historical event? Or was it another case of the medieval world being medieval? The city that danced itself to death. Let's set the scene. It's July 1518, and the city of Strasbourg, which was back then part of the Holy Roman Empire, today a much calmer corner of France, is ticking off all of the worst items on the 16th century suffering checklist. Famine? Absolutely. Food shortages have been hammering the city for months. Disease? You better believe bubonic plague and syphilis are taking turns. Crushing religious anxiety? Maybe double or triple check this one. This is post-plague Europe. The end times could be next Tuesday for all anybody knew. The mood in Strasbourg? Grim. The people? Desperate. And right in the middle of this gloomy Renaissance soap opera, a woman named Frau Troffea decides to throw some chaotic energy into the mix. One morning, without warning, she steps out into the dusty, grimy streets and starts to dance. Not an elegant waltz, not a polite jig, not some elaborate choreographed flash mob. Just frantic, uncontrolled, seemingly compulsive dancing. No music, no audience, no reason. At first, the good citizens probably figured she was drunk, possessed, or just having a really rough day, or all of the above. Medieval Europe had a lot of rough days. A little public weirdness wasn't that unusual. But then, she didn't stop. Hours passed, then days, and she kept going. No rest, no sleep, no explanation. Just relentless, feverish movement, as if she was trapped inside her own medieval Flashdance remake. And then, like an extremely cursed TikTok trend, others began to join her. First a handful, then dozens. Eyewitnesses claimed the dancers moved without pause, day and night, as if their bodies no longer took instruction from their brains. People collapsed from exhaustion. Some reportedly broke bones, others foamed at the mouth, their faces locked in expressions of terror or ecstasy. Hard to tell which, to be fair. And according to some chroniclers, the ones who loved a good dramatic flourish, dozens, maybe even hundreds, eventually dropped dead right in the streets. Death by exhaustion, death by dehydration, death by heart attacks, or possibly just sheer commitment to the bit. Faced with this bizarre spectacle, city authorities did what any responsible government should do when confronted with a mass outbreak of inexplicable public twerking. They called in the doctors. And what was the best medical advice at the time? Well, they decided it was a natural disease, and the prescription? More dancing. Yes, really. They figured that the afflicted needed to dance it out like a 16th century emotional detox. So they built a stage. They hired musicians. They even opened a dedicated dancing hall, all to encourage the afflicted to keep going, presumably until the demons got bored and left. Capitalism strikes again. It was essentially the world's first medically supervised dance marathon, and quite possibly the worst rehab program in history. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. The dancers just kept dancing and more people collapsed, and the story of Strasbourg's deadly dance marathon began its slow dramatic march into the annals of weird history. Now, did the dancing plague of 1518 really happen, or are we dealing with a case of 500-year-old medieval clickbait? The Renaissance equivalent of "you won't believe what happens next" headline. Well, surprisingly, yes, there is solid historical documentation that something very weird went down in Strasbourg that summer. We've got city council notes, dry but wonderfully panicked official documents from local authorities, which express growing alarm at the weird outbreak of involuntary choreography clogging up their streets. These weren't scandal sheets or tavern gossip. These were the guys running the city, and they were losing their collective minds. Medical accounts. 16th century doctors scribbling furiously into their notes, trying to figure out how to stop the dancers without, accidentally killing them faster. Medicine back then wasn't really known for its light touch. Church sermons, because when you live in medieval Europe and weird stuff happens, it's basically standard protocol to assume that Satan is involved. Bonus points, you can tie it back to moral failings like gluttony, gambling, or not attending enough sermons, or just simply not paying enough to the church. But, and here's the important bit, if you really start to poke at the sources, things get a bit murky. Because contemporary accounts do describe a strange outbreak of dancing, but the numbers start to balloon suspiciously in later retellings. Some versions peg it at 400 people who were gripped by this spontaneous urge to dance. But that figure likely comes from later chroniclers who were, shall we say, generously rounding it up a bit to make the story sound a bit more dramatic. If you peel back the layers, stick to the records closer to the actual event, the more conservative estimates suggest that the number of dancers was probably closer to 30 or 40. A lot, sure, but not the medieval Coachella some stories make it out to be. As for the death toll, well, it's suspiciously vague. Contemporary sources mention people collapsing. They don't exactly give us a neat ledger of deaths. And given the conditions of the time, general malnourishment, plague floating around the air, basic hygiene being a novel concept, collapsing from exhaustion wasn't necessarily a one-way ticket to death. It was just your average Wednesday. In fact, the collapsing wasn't immediately fatal, and that tells us about how accustomed people were to brutal physical hardship than it does about the deadliness of the dance itself. So yeah, while there was a weird outbreak of public dancing, it doesn't mean the image of hundreds dropping dead in the streets like some macabre medieval soul train is actually true. It's probably a bit of post-event myth-making, exaggerated, embroidered, polished up over the centuries until it sparkled like a particularly grim fairy tale. So in short, yeah, they danced, and yes, it was weird, but no, it probably wasn't apocalyptic, by any means. So, what actually happened? If hundreds of people didn't actually boogie themselves to the grave in some kind of medieval death rave, what did happen? Historians and scientists have spent centuries tossing around a few competing theories. They're all trying to figure out why a bunch of people in Strasbourg decided to continuously cut a rug for days on end. Let's take a closer look. Mass hysteria, or mass psychogenic illness. This is the frontrunner in the race to explain the madness. Mass hysteria, or now politely rebranded as mass psychogenic illness. This happens when psychological stress gets so intense, it starts producing real physical symptoms. Yes, your brain can stress you out so much that your body just says, you know what, let's just dance. And let's be clear, life in 1518? Pretty rough. Life in France in general? Pretty rough. Famine, disease, a constant fear of the divine wrath, and not a TikTok dance challenge in sight to provide any kind of catharsis. If your neighbour started twitching and spinning in circles, you might just join in too, partly because of the social contagion effect, and partly because why not? This was essentially the medieval version of peer pressure. One person starts doing something weird and suddenly the whole neighbourhood's in a frenzy. No hashtags required. When you've got a few highly suggestible, highly stressed out people dancing in the streets, the pressure cooker of medieval life can turn it into a full-blown event. It's not possession. It's not poison. It's your brain staging a very inconvenient flash mob because it literally can't handle the way things are anymore. Although there are some more pharmaceutical explanations. Ergot. Ergot is a mould that grows on rye, which, if you've ever baked bread during damp weather, you know is bad news. It can cause hallucinations, muscle spasms, convulsions, basically all the highlights of a truly terrible acid trip. Fun fact, ergo is technically similar to LSD if you look at a chemical perspective. So yes, if your bread is mouldy enough, your next sandwich might come with a surprise side of hallucinations and twitching. Which sounds like a slam dunk for the dancing plague, right? Well, not quite. Whilst ergo poisoning can cause serious physical effects, I'm really sorry, I don't know if it's ergo or ergot. It can cause, psychological effects like spasms, convulsions, psychosis. It doesn't tend to cause coordinated rhythmic movement. It's more like thrashing, seizing and generally flailing around, not cutting loose to the medieval equivalent of Uptown Funk. Although, that could sound like French dancing for all I know. Plus, ergo outbreaks tend to be messy. Lots of vomiting, lots of violent convulsions, and lots of people too sick to stand, let alone organise an involuntary street party. So while ergot may have played a role in medieval oddness generally, it probably wasn't the driving force behind this impromptu dance marathon. Religious ecstasy or demonic possession. Now of course, if you ask people at the time what was going on, they would have pointed the finger somewhere a lot more dramatic than we do today. God or Satan. Medieval Europe was a place where the supernatural was part of the furniture, especially in the Holy Roman Empire. If something weird happened, plagues, bad weather, outbreaks of unsolicited boogieing, it was either by divine intervention or devilish interference. There wasn't much room for middle ground, so some believed that the dancers were cursed, paying penance for a sin known and sins unknown. Others thought they were possessed by the devil, victims of some invisible evil force compelling them to dance until their bodies gave out. Cue mass prayers, candlelit processions, stern sermons about the wages of sin, all the medieval greatest hits. But whilst the religious fervour can explain a lot about why people believe what they were seeing, it doesn't really explain why their neighbours couldn't stop doing the Macarena until they collapsed. Lastly, we have St. Vitus dance, which does sound kind of charming, until you realise it was a catch-all medieval diagnosis for uncontrollable convulsions, muscle spasms and twitches. Named after St. Vitus, the patron saint of dancers, epileptics, and people having a generally rough time. This condition is now thought to resemble chorea, a symptom of neurological disorders like Huntington's disease. In the 16th century, though, St. Vitus dance was basically shorthand for "we don't know why you're moving so weirdly, let's blame God instead." Again, it doesn't fully explain the mass aspect of the event, or why entire groups of people would break into coordinated fits of movement together. Spoiler, most modern historians lean heavily towards mass hysteria, triggered by extreme stress, social contagion, and just the right amount of medieval superstitions to keep things lively. So in short, no LSD bread, no demons, no divine boogie curse, just a lot of very stressed out people in 1518 whose bodies said, "Screw it, I've had enough, let's dance." And honestly, relatable. So why does this myth endure? Why does this story survive? Well, why 500 years later are we still talking about a bunch of people in funny hats dancing themselves into the grave in the middle of a medieval city square? Why does it pop up in history books, podcasts like this one, and late night pub conversations after a few too many pints? Or is that just me and my mates in the pub? But let's be honest, it's irresistible. The idea of dancing to death hits a very specific nerve in the human imagination. It's bizarre, it's theatrical, it's tragic, and being real for a second, it's hilarious. It is genuinely like a grim slapstick tragedy. A medieval flash mob that's gone lethally wrong. You can imagine a Monty Python sketch but with much higher stakes, and it's the kind of story that just sounds so absurd that you want it to be true. What's history without unhinged chaos? It also feels strangely familiar. Mass panic, social contagion, one person's weird behaviour spreading until it becomes everyone's weird behaviour. TikTok. We like to think mass hysteria is a relic of the past, a symptom of a more gullible, less enlightened time, but spoiler alert, it's really not. Social fads, moral panics, viral challenges, mass behaviours, these didn't start with smartphones. They've been with us forever. We are now, and always have been, a species painfully susceptible to joining in when we see a crowd doing something, anything weird. There's so much social thought experiment to this topic. From medieval dance marathons to modern day TikTok trends where people, eat detergent pods or glue their hair to their heads, human beings have a long and proud history of making terrible decisions en masse. The dancing plague sticks around not because it's the weirdest thing to ever happen, although it is a strong contender, but because it's a mirror. It's a reminder that under the right conditions, stress, fear, collective tension, we will do the strangest things imaginable. And then we'll turn it into a story to scare, entertain, and maybe make ourselves feel a little bit better about how weird we are ourselves. It's not just a funny historical footnote. It's a historical warning. The line between everyday normalcy and full-blown crude madness is thinner than we'd like to admit. So next time you see a flash mob start up, maybe for your own safety, don't join in. So, did hundreds of people dance themselves to death in Strasbourg in 1518? Probably not. Despite the vivid, dramatic images painted by later writers, no, it wasn't a medieval version of Footloose where the whole town danced itself into oblivion. Did a handful of people, maybe 30 or 40, suffer from some combination of extreme stress, mass hysteria, and the crushing psychological weight of 16th century life, resulting in spontaneous, uncontrollable dance marathons confusing the heck out of everyone, from the city council to the town's most stern-faced priests? Probably. And is it still, centuries later, one of history's weirdest and weirdly relatable flash mobs? Absolutely. Because if there's one thing history teaches us, it's that no matter the century, no matter the city, humans will always find spectacularly new ways to collectively lose the plot. And sometimes, that looks a lot like dancing yourselves into the history books. Thank you for listening. New episodes of Probably Not True drop every Monday because weird history isn't going to debunk itself. If you want more bonus episodes, behind the scenes chaos, and terrible history jokes that couldn't quite squeeze into the regular show, check out our Patreon. Link is in the show notes. Stay weird, stay skeptical, stay curious, because remember, if it sounds too strange to be true, it's probably not true. Next time on Probably Not True, we're going out of this world with one of history's most persistent conspiracy theories, the Great Moon Landing hoax. Did NASA really land on the moon in 1969? Or was it just a low-budget production with really great lighting? Wake up, sheeple! Spoiler. It's probably not true. Stay tuned.